Hello, my name is Tom Horsten. I've written this book that's just been translated, Der Pater und der Philosoph. It's about a priest from my family, and it's because of him that here in Leuven, where we are now, in the Husserl archives, you can find this book. This is the first copy of Silent Sight by Martin Heidegger. And to some people, I think this must be the holy grail of German philosophy in the 20th century. So it is the first copy that he gave to his teacher, Edmund Husserl, with a double written dedication. And it has all the notes made by Husserl while he was reading the book, still in the book. And this book got to Leuven 80 years ago, more than 80 years ago even, because of a priest, and it's now in the Husserl archives where we are now. And next to me is Professor Dr. Julia Janssen. She's the director of the Husserl archives. Professor, maybe you could tell us a bit who was Edmund Husserl and what do you have here in the Husserl archives here in Leuven?
Yes, thanks, Ton. Edmund Husserl, as you said, was also, among other things, the teacher of Martin Heidegger. Edmund Husserl actually first studied mathematics before he got into philosophy, also under the big impression of Franz Brentano, who lectured philosophy at the time in Vienna. So we're talking the late 19th century. And then beginning with Husserl's logical investigations, just at the turn of the century, he was one of the founders of what we nowadays call phenomenology. He tried to introduce a different method into philosophy, and above anything, he wanted to reconstitute a philosophy that would really speak to and analyze people's lives, people's lived experiences, so away from big systems and big concepts, down to earth, as it were, down to people's experiences.
But scientific, for him it was...
Absolutely, yeah. So that's really, a dimension of Husserl's thought that not every of his students was going to follow. Heidegger, for example, only followed it in a very particular way. Others, like, for example, the French existentialists, who were also very inspired by Husserl, because he wasn't the only inspiration, but a very important one, also sought their resources more in lived experiences and less in this idea of rigorous science, which was absolutely Husserl's idea.
Yeah. And here at the Husserl archives, what do you have here? We are sitting in front of the library of Husserl?
We're sitting in front of the most important part of his library, so we're very lucky that the Institute of Philosophy in Leuven here, back when Husserl's estate came to Leuven, actually bought his private research library. I say this is the most important part of his library because it contains the books that have annotations. So researchers till this day come, they look, what did he write in the margins, what are his comments, how deep was his engagement with contemporary authors, but also, of course, the history of philosophy. Yeah. And then we have his manuscripts, over 40,000 pages. You describe it in your book very, very well. Yeah. That's what your book is about. It was an enormous undertaking to get everything to Leuven, and of course under very difficult circumstances. But I think your book tells that story.
Yeah. I hadn't heard anything about the story of Husserl. I studied philosophy here in Leuven at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. And I had some exams on Heidegger, and that was the only time that Husserl was mentioned. But nobody talked about the archives here. Only, I think, 9 or 10 years ago, I was talking with my father on a Sunday evening, together with his grandchildren, the children of my sister. And he was showing pictures of his wedding and the wedding of two of his brothers, I think. and there was a picture of my grandmother talking with a priest, and she apparently liked him very much. And I said to my father, I asked him, who is this man? Oh, that's it, that's her favorite cousin, Father van Breda. And how did he know? Yeah, when there was a feast or a party, he was there. But also when there was a problem in the family, he came over to help solve the problem. And what did he do in life? I asked. He did something with philosophy. And we are in Leuven, that's all I know, something with philosophy. But wait, I think I have his death letter, his death notice. And my father went to look for it, and he came back with a death notice, and it says, Pater Herman Leo van Breda. And he had an honorary doctorate in Freiburg. He had honorary medals from West Germany, Holland, Belgium. He had a Yad Vashem medal from Israel. He was acknowledged as a resistance fighter. And I asked my father, what did he do? And my father, I don't know. And I said, okay, I will look into it because I think it interests me what this man has done. And so I stumbled on the story of the safe thing of the Husserl archives. And in the beginning, I just wanted to know what happened, but somewhere in the course of this research, I got caught by the story, and I found it very strange that nobody had written this down. He himself has given a speech in the YMO at the end of the 50s, I think. And this text has been published, but it's very limited. He leaves out some unpleasant parts for people that were still alive at that time. And then came the moment that I discovered that he did the same thing that he did with Husserl's legacy, namely saving these papers from Nazi Germany, and smuggling them out of Germany, bringing them to Leuven. That he did this trick twice, because just after the war he also saved the writings of Edith Stein, who had been an assistant of Husserl at the beginning of the century, just at the beginning of the First World War.
And he even tried to rescue her.
He even tried to rescue her, yeah. He went to visit her when she was in a convent in Holland, but she didn't want to go. And only a few weeks after she was with her sister, who was also in a convent in Holland, they were brought to Auschwitz, and there they were murdered. So he did this twice, and that's the moment I decided I will write this down. And then I started a search, because this happened mainly in the years before the war, and then during the war, because he was hiding all these 40,000 manuscripts you have here on all kind of different places in Belgium. He had several Jewish philosophers working for him while they were hiding here in Belgium and transcribing these manuscripts, because that's what made what he did much more dangerous. Is he couldn't read these documents because they were written down in Gabelsberger Steno. How do you say Schnellhandschrift or
Kurzhandschrift? Yeah.
And that it more or less looks like if you put a chicken in black ink and then you put it on a paper. That's more or less how it looks like to me.
Right, right. But that's of course also why he needed to have these people at the Institute. No? He needed to organize more than just a safe place for the manuscripts. If anybody was going to be able to access Husserl's thought, then competent people needed to transcribe the manuscripts. No?
But when he was smuggling first these manuscripts from the south of Germany to Berlin, he did it by train. That's what made it very, very dangerous, because
he risked his own life.
He risked his own life, because if the Gestapo would have found it, he couldn't explain what it was.
Yeah, just some secret code.
Just a secret code, 40,000 pages. So it was really an incredible story. And so I decided just to write it down as it happened.
But you had to do quite a bit of research too.
I had to do quite a bit of research, and I was fortunate to find the few remaining witnesses of the period during the war, because at that time a lot of things happened,
Yeah.
but nothing was written down because it all happened in illegality. And so I was very happy to find people yeah, that could tell me what happened. Because, yeah, I still have some blind spots. For instance, we didn't talk about it until now, but also the widow of Husserl in the end came to Leuven just before the war. She wanted to go to America because she didn't get a visa. So she was still here on the 10th of May when the German army invaded Belgium. And she stayed here for the war, and she hid in a convent very close to Leuven. And she was here. And Van Breda was also taking care of her. But she was hiding, that's what I've been told. But I found an envelope, the envelope in which the yellow star from Malvine Husserl was sent to her. And it was in an envelope, and on the address it said, Malvine Husserl, per address, Herman Leo van Breda, Kardinaal Mercierplein, Leuven.
So it was known where she
So
was.
the Germans knew
Yeah.
that she was here and that he had something to do with
But
it.
that's also part of your story. It's one of the very interesting satellite stories to your central story.
Yeah, and that's what makes it.
The person who held his protective hand over Malvine and others also.
I haven't been able to reconstruct this story completely. Van Breda was a very charming man. Eh? You see, if you look at this, he looks a bit like Dean Martin in his best days. And
there are even better pictures in the book.
There are even better pictures in the books where he's
really
it
comes through very well.
A film star. Yeah. and he was very successful in having people work for him and helping him. And one of the people he had a very tight relationship with was Reinhold von Thaden. And Reinhold von Thaden was a member of the Bekennende Kirche in Germany, that is known for Bonhoeffer mainly, I think. But he was mobilized for the army, and he was the head of the Militärverwaltung here in Leuven. And everybody I was able to talk with, assistants who worked with Van Breda in the 50s and 60s, they said they had a very close relationship. Van Breda talked about von Thaden a lot. I think in 1948, 1949, he was received as a guest by the Major of Leuven in the town hall. So that's something you don't
wouldn't expect. Yeah.
You wouldn't expect from someone from an occupying army 5 years before.
Yeah.
But I've been told that von Thaden put Malvine Husserl under his protection. Only there's nothing on paper because
they couldn't be.
They couldn't be.
But she stayed until 1946, no? Before she finally got a visa.
And then she went to her children in America.
And we're actually still in contact with the family. So these are now great nephews.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and nieces. But
in America, mainly.
Yeah. That's the family Rosenberg. So Husserl's daughter Elisabeth married Rosenberg, and then so the family is.
Yeah, that was an art critic specialized in.
And in fact, the family still owns formally the manuscripts. They're given to us in perpetuity to protect them, to make them accessible to researchers all over the world and to an interested public. But they formally retain property of the estate, other than the library that was actually bought, as I said. No?
Okay.
Yeah. So once in a while, we even have to be in contact with one another.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then after the war, Van Breda started publishing this transcription of these manuscripts. He has 2 series that are still running, I think.
Yeah, that's the Husserliana, that's the most important, no? So the collected works, as it were, in the German original. And we just published volume 43, so the publications are still ongoing. We still have about 10 to 15% of manuscripts untranscribed, so there's still some work to be done. And of course, this is very meticulous, slow work that doesn't find a lot of support in the contemporary sort of scientific context or academic apparatus. So it takes a long time, no? Because you can't have a lot of people doing it, and very few people know how to transcribe. Very few people can read Gabelsberger. It's been outdated for such a long time, since the introduction of the new standardized German Kurzschrift. And so that's a difficult skill to learn, and a very slow work.
You have to find people that can read the Gabelsberger Steno and know enough about
they
the
need to have philosophical insight, because the Gabelsberger it's so ambiguous. I mean, a lot of it's typical of stenography in general, but in Husserl's case, you have so many personal abbreviations, so many personal symbols that he used, so it's quite idiosyncratic. Plus, there's no punctuation, and you cannot make, for example, you cannot see very well from the symbol whether something is transcendental or transcendent, so these are important questions. If you get them wrong, so technically, then you have a problem. So you need people who are very well versed in Husserlian phenomenology and philosophy, but they need to have the skill of the Gabelsberger and the patience and the willingness to give up a big part of their academic life that they could, of course, also use to write publications and so on and so forth. So you need really very committed people, and I'm very glad that our team is like that here, so I'm very pleased.
How many people can read the Gabelsberger Steno?
All over the world, I would say, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so, or a few more, Now, these are the people I know through the context of Husserlian scholarship. There were also other scientists at the time, and intellectuals who used Gabelsberger. Maybe it would be an idea to see what those colleagues are doing. But I mean, we're very glad, and I personally am very glad that you wrote this book, that you put the pieces together. I think it shows, on the one hand, of course, most directly what happened here at the archives. It also tells a different story, or some story, of Husserl. So it's, of course, van Breda is at the center, but we also hear more about Husserl. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's still, I think, in the wider public, much more of a sort of recognition of the name Heidegger than Husserl. So I think you help bring that a little bit to light. But I think also the lessons of the book are more general, because I think science or academia in general has always needed people like van Breda. You call him in the book a kind of
academic manager.
Wissenschaftsmanager, and maybe some people look down on that a little bit, so there's also, of course, always a bit, he wasn't a great philosopher himself, and so on and so forth, but I think academia has always needed people like that, and their stories are rarely told. Like the story of Malvina Husserl, I think that comes through in your book very well as well. She stayed at her own peril in Germany to support her husband's estate. And these are stories that I think if people were to look more, and I think you were mentioning earlier, that nobody had told the story. Why didn't somebody come earlier and tell the story? I think in part it's also, we've only, as a society, learned in the last few decades that, science and academia is more about more people than just the people that appear on the cover of books. So I think on different dimensions, I'm really glad that you're telling this story.
But now the book is translated in German. what was new to me, I haven't been, I had some lessons in philosophy, and I've read a bit, but I'm no trained philosopher. Now the book is published in Germany, and what I learned now is that you have almost a divided academic community with the Husserl people on the one side and the Heidegger people on the other side. For the Heidegger people, I think is difficult about this book is that there's no way to make this a good story for Heidegger.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly the figure of Heidegger has always polarized, no? I mean, in the positive sense and in the negative sense. And of course, independently of any other aspects of his life or work, I think it's fair to say the way he treated Husserl and his family after years of mentoring and support and so on and so forth cannot really be rewritten as a good story. No? I mean, I know that Heidegger, and you mentioned it too in your book, no, that Heidegger tried to take position to that later, no, that he emphasized that it was actually the Husserls who had broken up contact and so on and so forth. No? Indeed, that doesn't say, you know, how much that says about Heidegger. We can leave to
what
the
I
readers.
What I thought was intriguing to me is Emmanuel Levinas, who came to Freiburg to study with Husserl, but then discovered Heidegger.
Yeah.
But after the war, he said, I can forgive a lot of people, but I cannot forgive Heidegger. And to him, Van Breda was more or less the anti-Heidegger. So he really saw a contrast between this big, important philosopher who at the moment of truth didn't do what he should have done. And then you have this unimportant philosopher, a priest, who at the very same moment does everything that has to be done. And that contrast is in the book as well.
Mm-hmm.
Although I hope I don't make a hero out of Van Breda, because he was vain, he was obsessed with Husserl, with all the...
He got a lot done.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not always clear how exactly, and But I think it's good that it's left ambiguous that way, because it really strikes me that, you know, that's what it's like. In order to do what Van Breda did, you have to call in favors, you have to do favors, you have to make compromises, and I think to write a neat, polished story about that, would be dishonest and less convincing than your story.
And what also helped in the case of Levinas, that Van Breda published his second series, Phenomenologica, and Totalité Infinie, the most important work by Levinas, was published by him, because Levinas couldn't find a publisher in France. Even Gallimard turned it down. So
that's right. Yeah.
That's probably the reason that he really.
Yeah, and I mean, it also highlights that Van Breda already tried to make the archives more than just archives. It wasn't meant to be a shrine, you know, for Husserl, where people, I mean, we were talking about people who came to visit, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, Ricoeur, etc., but not to just bow in front of the master, but in order to engage with his work, and also to enjoy the exchange with other people who visit, and the people who work here. And that's, you know, to some extent what of course we're trying to maintain until today. No, it's an archive, but also a research center.
Yeah. What struck me when I did my research is that you discover a lot of material that says that the philosophical community at the University of Leuven had a very ambiguous relationship to Van Breda. Everybody says they wrote it. He's not an important philosopher. He hasn't published anything of importance. But if they needed an important philosopher from another country, they had to pass through Van Breda because he knew everybody. He knew Imgarden, he knew Gadamer, he knew Derrida even, things like that. There's a letter somewhere by Foucault. He met Sartre, he knew everybody. So that's the strange thing here. You have this, it was a Catholic university with a neo-Thomistic tradition.
Right.
And here comes a priest who puts this university at the center of the continental debates from the time. And to me it was very strange to see that his colleagues, were they jealous or what was it?
Well, he was young, he was popular, he was in what he did extremely successful. And I don't find it very hard to imagine that, of course, that not everybody is approving of this all the time. But I think Van Breda had no problem with that. No, I think that comes out in your book as well. No, he was very able to also do things that others might not approve of and follow his line. If he thought it had to be done, then.
When he died, one of the problems that Attlee, his successor, had to face was where did the money come from? Nobody knew.
Of course, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, in part, it was a practice that made a lot of sense during the German occupation. I mean, you didn't want to have records lying around that said where you're hiding something and where you might be getting support from. But it seems that Van Breda kept that practice up until the 70s. When he died too young, unfortunately, and that's quite right. Sam Eisling, I think, had a hard time putting the pieces together. But had a very good time energizing that whole culture, surrounding also the French existentialist deconstruction and so on and so forth. So he was really able to continue that path.
What also struck me when I was doing my research is that when I looked at the story at the beginning, it was all about the war. For Van Breda, there was a second moment of sheer panic at a certain point. That was in 1968 with the student protests here in Leuven. In Belgium, the student protests were really centered on the problems in Leuven with the French and the Dutch-speaking communities. And at a certain point, it was decided that a new university for the French language students would be built in close to Ottignies in the French part of Belgium. And in the library, for instance, the collection was divided in two. And Van Breda was very, very, very scared that also the Husserl archives would be cut in two. In the end, this didn't happen. But a Husserl archive was opened in Louvain-la-Neuve. So,
and we're still, I mean, at the time also the Phänomenologica was in a way split, or should we say we have been cooperating since then with our colleagues in Louvain-la-Neuve, because Tamignon, who at the time worked here in Leuven, agreed to go to Louvain-la-Neuve and continued the cooperation, especially concerning the Phänomenologica.
Because of what happened in the war, to Van Breda it was very important to have Husserl archives, sort of dépendances, all over the world. Some of them still exist.
Yes, as far as I know, all of them exist.
Yeah.
So the first one that was agreed was the dépendance in Freiburg. Yeah, so that was the first step, and to have Eugen Fink, one of Husserl's last assistants, who became a professor there, head or direct an Husserl archives in Freiburg. And that still exists. All the dépendances have copies of the manuscripts, and they help with the accessibility and the research and so on and so forth. So that was, when was that? I think late 40s or maybe 1950. Only a year after, another one followed in Cologne, also still very important colleagues for us, and a vibrant research center. Now, what didn't happen so smoothly and didn't happen so quickly, and you tell the story in your book, is the Husserl archives in Paris. Yeah. Because Merleau-Ponty, of course, was one of the, maybe the first visitor here in the Husserl archives in 1939, yeah. To look at Husserl's manuscripts, and not long thereafter, conversations started about wouldn't it be, given also the sort of the influence of Husserl's thought on French philosophy, wouldn't it be good to have an archive in Paris? And Merleau-Ponty was all for it, Ricoeur was all for it, and then there were some who resisted it, and I think it took, correct me if I'm wrong, until 1957 or so.
A long time,
something like that, no?
I think almost 20 years before.
But Merleau-Ponty became first director, and Paul Ricoeur took over from him after that. So that's still, till this day, again, very important colleagues. And then, of course, also through the war, and in part because of the immigrants, the European immigrants into the United States, that became a very important readership. And in order to facilitate that, there were also opened dépendances in New York at the New School, and at Duquesne, at the University of Duquesne. So, and in part, as you said, the idea was, well, what if something happens again? What if the next rescue will not be successful? So better to
before microfilms and digitalization.
But of course, it also helped. What we nowadays talk a lot about in academia, at the time, Breda was, to a certain extent, pioneering it in our context anyway. It helped the networking. So again, very fruitful idea, apart from the conservation of the estate.
In a few years, it will be 50 years since Van Breda died. You still have to publish 15%. How much time will it take before the job is done?
Yeah, I mean, we have at the moment 2 to 3 more volumes in preparation for the Husserliana. But it's also true that the manuscripts weren't transcribed, as it were, from A to Z, but were selected, what seemed the most important at the time, what is the most sort of continuous, integral piece that one could publish. And so of what is left, there's also very short notes or things that are, I would say, with respect, perhaps philosophically less important. So it's more about finding the gems and the interesting nuggets that are still there, and that lends itself much more to the digital project that we run here at the archive. So we've been very busy for 5 years now to, first of all, in order to secure long-term preservation, really digitize all the manuscripts. We're very happy that that process has been concluded. That's safe now, but we're also increasingly making available other documents, and eventually we also want to prepare digital editions of the remaining manuscripts.
Okay, and the manuscripts that were published at the beginning, when you look at them now, were they done in a good way, or
were they done in a perfect way? Of course not. They were done under a lot of pressure. I think some good decisions were taken. Van Breda knew that something needed to be published, something needed to come out, as it were, also in order to secure the standing and establishment of the archives, and to prove that, you know, whoever is giving money can see some what we nowadays call output in academia. So I think he was very right, or the team at the time was very right to push for a quick publication of, you know, whatever was first available. And of course, these things don't stand as written in stone. No, we are constantly re-engaging also with the first volumes, for example, the Cartesian Meditations, and you know, interpretation, but in some cases even transcription is continuously improved. Things don't just stand as they are, and that is very in line with how Husserl worked. No? That's why also the digital project, in a way, it sounds so modern and 21st century, although by now that's not very cutting edge anymore by itself, no? But it's very much in line with his way of writing while thinking, with, you know, continuously revising and editing and adding to and subtracting from. And this kind of work you can much more easily make visible in digital editions. For the old, what we now call the analog edition, the Husserliana, so much work by the editors goes into the last bit of the book, which is called the text critical apparatus. To somehow retrace all these steps, and then we all know it, very few people actually read it. And so in a digital edition you can make that visible and accessible much more easily, hopefully, than.
And everybody can make his own or her own edition.
That's true as well. Of course, you can select also. I mean, the way, in part, the way texts were put together in different Husserliana volumes. I mean, for some Husserliana volumes that wasn't so relevant because there were already lecture scripts by Husserl, or so coherent text that could be published. But for others, it was editors who had a certain thematic interest, and then selected accordingly. But of course, other selections would have been possible, and research interest change, or new ones arise, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of flexibility in that. And I think Van Breda, the way he tried to stir the pot in the beginning and get everything going, was always trying to instill this kind of spirit here in the archives.
So it's still here.
It's still there in a bit, Okay. I don't know whether his charisma is still there, or, but that kind of collaborative spirit, I think, is there.
Okay. I thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
And okay, and the complete story is in Der Pater und der Philosoph, and this is an interesting book as well. Bye. Thank you.